Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Can I have your attention, please, again? Thank you. Thank you so much for all come here. My name is Victoria. I am the Vice President of the HBC. And first of the day, we're going to have this amazing keynote speakers. He's a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and also the former chairman at the CFTC. Let's welcome Tim Massey.
Good morning. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, all of the organizers. You've done an amazing job. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to kick off this Harvard Blockchain Conference. I've attended the last one or two, and boy, it's really grown, which is terrific. Now, you know, a conference kickoff speech like this often talks about all the great speakers that will follow, and there are many great speakers that will follow. But I think most of you already know that. You know you're going to hear from very talented people involved in some cutting-edge developments, and I assume you wouldn't voluntarily be sitting here on a beautiful spring day on a Saturday unless you were already very interested in hearing from them. So I don't think I need to do that. And even though I spent a lot of my time talking about and writing about the subject of regulation of digital assets, I'm not going to do a deep dive about that either. I'll say a few words about it. I'll talk generally about it. But frankly, a deep dive would quickly get technical. That might interest some of you. It might bore others of you. And I don't think that's the best way to kick off a conference either. So instead, I'm actually going to talk about you, the audience. Many of you are students at Harvard, whether that's the college or the business school or the law school or the Kennedy School or elsewhere. Many of you are students. I've seen, people from Boston University, Northeastern, Cornell, NYU, even Stanford, and other prestigious schools. So any of you who are currently in school, you will have very valuable credentials when you graduate. You will have a connection to a network of people that can be a tremendous resource to you throughout your career. And the question is, how will you use those valuable assets? And for those of you who aren't students, by the looks of it, looks like most people are at the early stages of their professional lives. I might see one or two who are close to my age, but I don't think so. So I hope, and simply, again, by virtue of being here, you got to be people who are really bright and really knowledgeable about this subject and have a lot of potential. So I hope you'll indulge me, someone who has a few decades on you probably in age, to offer some food for thought about your careers. I've titled my remarks, The Importance of Policy and Purpose. And I'm going to ask you to kind of drill down on your motivations for being here and your aspirations when it comes to the world of digital assets and blockchain, beyond just what particular sessions might interest you the most today. And I'm going to ask you to think about your role in this digital asset space, perhaps in a way that's a little different from how you've been thinking about it. I'm going to ask you to keep in mind two things always as you go through your professional career, and that's policy and purpose. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about policy because I'm the director of the Digital Assets Policy Project. It's a small project we started recently at the Kennedy School. I just do it part-time, where we try to use the resources of the school, and in particular the convening power of the school, to encourage discussion and debate on what are the appropriate public policies in this space. But I've actually been talking about these issues now for a decade, if you can believe that. I was chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and it was during my tenure in 2014 that the CFTC declared Bitcoin and other virtual currencies to be commodities. Now, that action, frankly, is misunderstood by a lot of people. We were not trying to initiate a battle between the CFTC and the SEC as to who has jurisdiction over this space, okay? So why did we take the action we took? Well, if you read the definition of commodity, it doesn't just spell out the things you would normally think of as a commodity, like wheat or cattle or corn. Part of the definition is actually kind of tautological. It essentially says if something is the subject of a derivatives contract, meaning a futures contract or a swap, then it is a commodity. That's it. So what happened? We had people coming into our office saying, well, I want to do some Bitcoin swaps. I want to offer Bitcoin swaps to the market. And we said, well, that makes Bitcoin a commodity, and we have some jurisdiction over that. So we said Bitcoin and other virtual currencies are commodities, and the courts have upheld that. Now, that doesn't mean a crypto asset can't be a security. And the definition of a security, as many of you may know, is an entirely different construct. Now, that's about as technical as I'm going to get today. But the point is, I began talking about those issues and the inadequacy of our regulatory framework back in 2014. I first testified before Congress on this subject in 2014. And here we are 10 years later, and not enough has changed, right? We still don't have, in my mind, a regulatory framework that adequately promotes investor protection and innovation. And I believe there are ways we can fix that, and I'm hopeful that we will, but it's still going to take some time. I'm not going to go into detail on how we solve that. If you're interested, go to our website, Digital Assets Policy Project, or to the Brookings Institution website, and you can find papers I've written. I've written also a few with the former Republican chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton, in the Wall Street Journal. But instead, I want to talk about what you can do to help resolve that, even if you're not a lawyer. And I want to talk about one of the major reasons why I believe we haven't resolved these issues. And that's because there is a great gulf in understanding. Now, what I'm about to say is, of course, a generalization. It's not true of everyone who participates in these issues, but a basic problem is we kind of have two groups of people, right? There are people who understand the technology, who are very excited about the technology, but who don't understand much about the public policy issues. That is financial regulation. They aren't familiar with the regulatory framework as it exists today, its objectives, or its origins. And on the other hand, we have people who are very familiar with regulatory and public policy issues, but who don't understand the technology. Now, many in the first group seem to have taken the motto, ignorance is bliss, to heart. Some of them think that, well, the law doesn't apply to me as long as I don't know what it is. Well, that's not true. Or they think, well, the technology really shouldn't be subject to existing national laws because the technology is borderless. Well, that's not true either. Or they think, well, we really need new laws because this technology is so innovative that the existing rules couldn't possibly be appropriate. But often they don't really understand the existing rules, and unless and until we come up with new ones, the existing ones apply. By contrast, many in the second group are very skeptical of the potential of the technology. They may also think the government is the best judge of that potential, which I don't agree with. They see mostly speculation and scams in the space and conclude that's the essential essence of the technology. Let's not encourage this. Let's not improve regulation because that might just cause more of it. We don't want that. So we don't have people who kind of understand both points of view and who recognize the legitimacy, if you will, of each point of view to a point. And that has contributed to the gulf in this resolution of public policy issues. So I want to ask you to do something about that. As you participate in this space, for however long and to whatever extent, I ask you to be as knowledgeable about the public policy issues as you can be and to recognize their importance and legitimacy. I am not suggesting you go out and get a law degree if you aren't already working toward that. But I am asking you to recognize that financial regulation exists for a reason, for multiple reasons. Most often for good reasons. Even if particular rules, as applied to particular situations may not be working so well. Those reasons include protecting investors and consumers, particularly in situations where asymmetrical information would otherwise put them at a disadvantage. It includes ensuring integrity in trading and markets. It includes preventing illicit activity and protecting financial stability. And that last one is particularly difficult because we don't always know what will cause financial instability. Now, before I chaired the CFTC, I was the Assistant Secretary for Financial Stability at the Treasury, overseeing the Troubled Assets Relief Program, the principal government response to the global financial crisis. I was at the Treasury on the front lines from the beginning of the Obama administration for 5 years. And then I worked on implementing reforms to address some of the underlying reasons that contributed to the crisis. Now, some of you, I hate to say this, may be too young to remember the financial crisis, but it caused millions of people to lose their homes, their jobs, their retirement savings, and their optimism about the future. And its aftermath fundamentally changed the politics of this country. You want to know where the Tea Party originated? Look at the financial crisis. So I'm not saying all this because I think crypto will be the source of the next financial crisis, but you should understand why many policymakers look at this space and they see a lot of speculation, they see a lot of leverage, they see people taking risks they don't understand, and so they worry. You have the ability to understand those issues and to appreciate their gravity. So I'm asking you to recognize the importance and legitimacy of the argument that we need regulation to minimize potential sources of financial stability and to address these other important objectives. So in short, we need people who can help bridge this gap in understanding, who can help find the appropriate policies by understanding the technology as well as the purposes of regulation, and by being honest, ruthlessly honest, and objective about the crypto sector. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. We all know Bitcoin was launched with great promise and great expectations. Bitcoin was intended to create a peer-to-peer system of payment, a highly decentralized system that would reduce our need to rely on centralized intermediaries like banks. It has not become that. It is not used generally for payments, right? And notwithstanding the promise of decentralization, we've recently passed what I consider a pretty ironic milestone. A milestone in which the thing that has happened, you could argue, fundamentally contradicts what the original Bitcoin white paper was all about. We now have some of the largest, most powerful financial institutions in the world offering a traditional investment product, an exchange-traded fund or an ETP, whichever one you want to call it, which is indirectly linked to Bitcoin. That product is traded on a centralized exchange. It is, in effect, a centralized pipe to a decentralized product. And it's a speculative investment, not a means of payment, offered by the kind of large traditional institutions that were meant to be displaced by Bitcoin. That's just what it is. Now, that doesn't mean Bitcoin couldn't become something else. That doesn't mean people shouldn't be allowed to trade Bitcoin. That doesn't mean Bitcoin ETFs are a bad thing. I'm just simply encouraging all of us to be honest about where we are and what it is. And the more we can speak truthfully and get past the hype and get past some fuzzy phrases, the easier it is to bridge understanding. Decentralization is a word that is used a lot when it comes to digital assets. And there may be ways in which digital assets can be a force for decentralization. Having served 8 years in the Obama administration on the front lines of the global financial crisis, which was in large part caused by concentration in our financial sector, or at least partly caused by that, I have some sympathy with the idea of bringing more decentralization to those parts of our financial system that are highly concentrated, if that's possible, without sacrificing efficiency or accountability or accessibility or transparency, other goals that we value. But DeFi means a lot of different things. It's used in a lot of different ways, and it's important to define what we mean by DeFi. We need to get past the buzzwords, or what Vitalik Buterin once described as the cult of decentralization. We got to also admit that centralized forces often take over technological innovations. I'm not making a value judgment once again. I'm just making an observation. Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan, may not think much of Bitcoin. He's made that clear, but he's committed a lot of resources to JP Morgan's Onyx division. If you haven't looked at their website recently, you should. They're doing some very interesting work in the blockchain space, and that may not be exactly what Satoshi had in mind. We often talk about Web3 or the Internet of Value, and I think those labels can be useful. But look at how we talk about another aspect of the Internet, which is the cloud, or cloud computing. Lots of companies rely on the cloud for the storage of information. You know, whoever came up with the phrase, the cloud, was brilliant, right? Because many people, including me sometimes, we use it as if it's this ethereal being or metaphysical force out there, a widely disseminated resource available to anyone everywhere. And we don't really think about, does anybody own this? Does anybody control this? And it's like cloud computing is basically provided by three big companies, right? Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And they have physical hardware, servers located in concentrations they try not to disclose, in part because transparency might increase their vulnerability. How many of you have heard of Seth Pendley? Anybody? Seth Pendley was this 28-year-old right-wing extremist who wanted to, quote, these are his words, kill off 70% of the internet. So he plotted to attack the Amazon servers in Virginia with a sawed-off shotgun. Now, fortunately, he succumbed to an FBI sting operation, and he wasn't able to do it, but still. Another example of word choice, of the importance of word choice. I just came from a meeting this week in San Francisco of a venture capital fund I'm involved in. It focuses on fintech investments. And someone gave a presentation in which they said, quote, the SEC hates crypto. And I've heard a lot of people use that phrase, especially this week after the Uniswap, Wells notice, you may have seen, indicating a likely enforcement action. And of course, we all use shorthand phrases. They're useful. But, we can't let labels obscure understanding. Chair Gary Gensler, who I've known for many years, thinks that the way most crypto tokens are distributed makes them securities under existing law, and they should be regulated as such. And he is focusing on enforcement actions to achieve that goal. And frankly, a lot more courts agree with him at this point than disagree with him. In case you missed it, another example of that this week was in the SEC's case against Coinbase, where the judge rejected Coinbase's motion to dismiss the case. And her opinion is quite broad and mostly quite favorable to the SEC. The industry doesn't like to talk about it, but that's what happened. Now, I don't think we'll get to the appropriate regulatory framework or an adequate regulatory framework through enforcement alone. But I think the goal of creating that better framework is better served by debating strategy and alternatives and than by debating motives, or at least being careful when we ascribe motives to people. Again, it requires people like you who can understand the technology and are excited about the technology, and also who can devote some time to understanding the policy issues and recognizing the importance of the policy issues, and to speak in plain English, honestly, about the technology and where we are and how we might get to where we want to go. And speaking of how you will devote your time, let me say a few words about purpose. I encourage you to think hard about your purpose, your goal in this space, beyond the particular things you might have come here to learn about today. If you are contemplating devoting a significant amount of time and energy to the sector, or if you're already engaged in that, which I know many of you are, how do you wish to make your mark? There's no right or wrong answer. You may have multiple purposes. Your purpose may change over time. That's often the case, but it's important to reflect on what it is. Your purpose could be to make money. By trading crypto, by creating your own startup, by joining a promising business in the space, making money is a fine purpose. Just do it through legitimate and ideally ethical means. We've got enough fraud and scams already in crypto. We don't need more. And having the benefit of, being a bit older, if your primary purpose is making money, it's good to think about what happens if you succeed, particularly as the years pass. If you're succeeding in accumulating wealth, it's good to think about what was it you wanted it for and how much is enough. I know a lot of very successful people who now look back and wonder why they work so hard for financial success. Wonder if maybe they shouldn't have rethought their purpose at some point. After all, you can't take all those toys with you to the grave. Maybe money is important, but somewhat secondary to you. Maybe you want to make your mark by building a better mousetrap of some sort. You want to create an app, a protocol, a device, or a business that generates greater human welfare. That's an excellent purpose also. Maybe you are motivated by a larger social goal or policy objective, and you believe blockchain technology can be harnessed to advance that objective. There are many good causes that might be advanced by digital asset technology. How might it help us address the challenge of climate change? Too often, crypto is seen as contributing to the problem more than the solution, of course, because of the enormous energy consumption related to proof-of-work consensus systems. But there are probably many potential ways that digital asset technologies could help address climate change, some being explored, some awaiting your insights and energies. Could they be used to create more efficient and transparent markets for carbon credits, a market that desperately needs some standardization? Could they be used to improve supply chain management and reduce the energy consumption of shipping, processing, or logistics? Could digital assets be used to create a financial system that is more inclusive? Now, that's certainly a goal that is often talked about with respect to digital assets. And it's an important one in this country as well as around the world. Over 20% of households in this country are either unbanked, meaning they do not have a bank account, or they are underbanked, meaning they have a bank account, but they prefer to use very costly non-bank services instead, like check cashers or payday lenders, because they can't afford to wait what is often 3 to 5 days for their paycheck to clear in order to pay their bills. Or they can't risk having an overdraft charge. Now, to date, I would say digital assets innovation hasn't really achieved anything significant in financial inclusion. Some people would differ with me. And, you could point out to the fact that people in countries with weak currencies have obtained access to the dollar through stablecoins. That's arguably a benefit. But certainly, financial inclusion is often cited as a goal for digital assets, and I encourage any of you who are contemplating that because I think it's a very important goal. You may recall when Facebook proposed creating Libra, it first described it as a new digital currency, and it was launched with the stated purpose of helping the billions of people who lack access to the financial system gain access. Now, whether that was Mark Zuckerberg's true goal or whether he simply wanted to aggregate even more data from even more people, one can debate. It was basically a stablecoin before we were really familiar with stablecoins or talking about stablecoins. But its design and the fact that Facebook was its sponsor led to widespread regulatory opposition, and it never got off the ground. But it prompted central banks around the world to engage in research and development of central bank digital currencies. And I think it contributed to an increased focus on the quality of payments and the efficiency of payments and financial inclusion issues with respect to payments, particularly in cross-border payments, which, it costs someone who has family in the Philippines 6%, maybe 8%, maybe 10% to send money back to their families. Shouldn't be the case. And so I mention that because it's a good example of the unpredictability of the pathway of innovation. And I'll give you another example from digital assets. How many of you have heard of the Bank for International Settlements? It's an NGO that's essentially a collection of all the central banks in the world based in Basel. And it has an innovation hub which is engaged in a number of very interesting projects with countries around the world on central bank digital currencies and improving payment systems generally. And one of those projects is called Project Mariana, which involves the European Central Bank, Switzerland, and Singapore. And they are experimenting with something borrowed from the world of DeFi, an automated market maker. Kind of interesting, to basically trade central bank digital currencies. So the point is that you can't predict the pathway of innovation, which is why I believe governments should not be trying to judge the utility of crypto in trying to regulate it. Instead, governments should be creating regulatory frameworks that address the risks and allow the market to figure out the utility of innovation. One more example of a good public policy purpose that clearly falls into, or where digital assets can make a difference. How do we balance the legitimate need to prevent illicit activity, such as money laundering and avoidance of sanctions, in the use of crypto? How do we balance that need with protecting privacy and preventing unreasonable searches and seizures? There is no fundamental right to privacy in financial transactions, and the pseudonymity and permanence of the blockchain, while it's helpful in tracing illicit activity, I don't think is enough in and of itself to detect, deter, and prevent illicit activity. So we may need new regulatory approaches, even new technologies, such as digital identity systems, to achieve that right balance. Of course, there are many, many other purposes you might have, and talking about the importance of purpose might seem obvious, maybe even a little pedantic, but it's good to think about it. It's even good to write down your aspirations and, kind of file that little piece of paper away. Look at it a few years later. You might change course. You might decide, gee, what I thought then isn't really what I want to do now, but it's a good way of kind of figuring out, where you want to go. You can change course. Many people do. Professional lives need not be linear. The journey is what's interesting. And you may find, as many of us have, that serendipity, chance encounters, and luck play a big role in your careers. You may find, as Steve Jobs once said, that you can only connect the dots of your career looking backward. You cannot do so looking forward. So, I hope my comments have given you some things to think about, at least either now or perhaps later as you go forward. I'm sure all of you have a lot to contribute. There are a lot of challenges out there that can benefit from your contributions. If you commit significant time and energy to digital assets, I hope you will think about the policy implications, even if they aren't the direct focus of your work. And whatever you do, I hope you will always think about your purpose and live a life of purpose, because it's the best way to be true to yourself. Thank you.
Test. Okay. It's a real honor to have former Chairman Timothy Massad